Stockholm Syndrome is a proposed condition in which a victim of an abusive or captive relationship develops a positive psychological bond with their captor or abuser. The term was originally coined in the analysis of a bank heist in Stockholm, Sweden. Bank clerks were held hostage by a bank robber, and through the course of this 6-day experience, seemed to develop positive feelings toward and even became protective of their captor. Now, an important thing to note in my understanding is that Stockholm Syndrome is not an officially recognized condition. There isn't enough research to confirm either way whether our popular culture understanding of Stockholm Syndrome is actually a genuine condition. This is probably because it only develops, if it does develop, under very specific conditions that are hard to study and unethical to replicate. But don't panic, that isn't an issue for this video. In this video, I want to look at the popular culture understanding of Stockholm Syndrome, most generally seen as an abuse victim developing positive feelings towards their abuser, and see if it can be used to understand natalism from an antinatalist perspective. Whilst natalists and antinatalists both agree that continuing to exist can and often is a fruitful pursuit, their divergence appears when discussing coming into existence. Whilst antinatalists can and do enjoy their lives, they stop short of saying that they're glad to have come into existence. The reason being that there is an important distinction between coming into existence and continuing to exist, or starting a life and continuing one. Now, regarding starting a life, this can't be done for the sake of the child that is going to be created, because before they're created, they don't exist. There is no one to need or desire or have an interest in coming into existence. Continuing a life, however, is a different ballpark and can be done for the sake of the individual whose life is being continued, because they exist and have an interest in continuing to exist. A natalist, on the other hand, is likely to say, even once this distinction is explained to them, that they're glad to be born. This is the key distinction between the natalist and the antinatalist position that I want to explore using the analogy of Stockholm Syndrome. So instead of analysing the relationship between an abuser and an abuse victim, or a captor and a captive, we're going to be examining the relationship between those who are glad to be born and their own coming into existence. As a hostage in a bank heist through experiencing Stockholm Syndrome may begin to feel positive feelings towards their captor, someone who is harmed by their coming into existence, in the antinatalist view, may feel positive feelings toward their coming into existence. Now, from an antinatalist perspective, it's probably quite intuitive to understand why someone who's glad to have been born is suffering from a Stockholm Syndrome-like condition in the relationship they have with their coming into existence. But I want to lay out how I see this analogy working so that those who it's less intuitive to understand can understand it a bit better. So Stockholm Syndrome has been proposed not just to arise in classical hostage situations, but also in other situations like domestic violence, cult indoctrination, imprisonment in a prisoner of war camp, prostitution, abuse to children, and probably more. The key dynamic being described is the presence of positive feelings towards, or even a level of protectiveness towards, a perpetrator by the victim. As detailed in the Encyclopedia Britannica, some have suggested specific psychological mechanisms that could cause Stockholm Syndrome to arise. Psychologists who have studied the syndrome believe that the bond is initially created when a captor threatens a captive's life, deliberates, and then chooses not to kill the captive. The captive's relief at the removal of the death threat is transposed into feelings of gratitude towards the captor for giving him or her life. And the entry later states, victims live in enforced dependence and interpret rare or small acts of kindness in the midst of horrible conditions as good treatment. Now, for anyone to fully appreciate the antinatalist view on this, or maybe it's more accurately referred to as the philosophically pessimistic view, they need to understand that many antinatalists and pessimists recognize the human condition as actually being much worse than many people perceive it, such that it's actually better referenced as the human predicament. Our lives are actually much worse than we generally appreciate. Now, rather than fully go into that, I'm going to link an article that I think is quite accessible on the topic, and hopefully that will give a bit more of an understanding. Understanding this context, though, it's pretty easy to see how those rare and small acts of kindness in the midst of horrible conditions as good treatment is analogous to someone interpreting rare and small appearances of meaning and genuine pleasure or comfort and satisfaction in their lives as something that could lead lead to someone looking fondly on their coming into existence. It also seems plausible that someone who's suffering from Stockholm Syndrome could also rationalize some or maybe even all of the harm that is being done to them by their abuser or captor, seeing it as necessary or somehow justified or outweighed by other considerations. It seems clear that this could occur in a typical case where perhaps a captive begins to develop positive or protective feelings towards their captor once they observe the dangerous situation that the captor has gotten themselves into. They're observing someone who's gotten themselves into a situation where they can either be shot by the police, shoot themselves, or go to prison, which isn't a nice situation for anyone to be in. And in certain conditions, I can imagine that if Stockholm Syndrome does arise, that captive or abuse victim could develop some sympathy towards their captor or abuser. As the situation dawns on the captor, they may begin to break down emotionally, and that could generate a feeling of care or protectiveness towards the captor by the captive, especially if there's been a sufficient amount of time for them to develop some bond or at least build familiarity. In the case of those who are glad to have been born, the many harms that they are subjected to as a result of coming into existence could be rationalized away as being necessary to get the good things in life, or maybe even seen as being outweighed by the good things in life. To flesh out why this is a rationalization and why there's maybe a parallel with Stockholm Syndrome, I want to explain a bit of a more fundamental point here. Being glad to have been born is essentially being glad to have been forced into a circumstance where you will undergo some significant level of harm and die as well, all without being able to even consent to it. Everyone suffers to at least a significant degree and will die, being ripped away from anything that you've become attached to in life. In return, your life contains some goods that go to only temporarily satiate the needs and desires built into you from the time that you were created. Our coming into existence isn't a benefit to us. We didn't exist to have any need, desire, or interest in coming into existence. We only have needs, desires, or interests in anything, including continuing to exist, because we were created in the first place. As Arthur Schopenhauer said, again, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. Through coming into existence, we now suffer the harms in life and death, all for goods that we never existed to want or need in the first place. Having an acceptance for this situation can help facilitate you getting on with your life, and that's one thing, and it's likely a sensible one. But to be glad to find yourself in such a predicament, from an antinatalist point of view, seems very much like a case of Stockholm Syndrome. It's also been speculated that Stockholm Syndrome could be a coping mechanism, relieving stress from the victim, but also potentially making them more cooperative with the abuser or captor, and these dynamics could prolong the victim's survival. The relieving of stress, at least, does look like it could carry over to the case of the glad to have been born. Being glad to have been born seems it could have a positive impact on your psychological disposition, in that, and I have not seen any particular research about this, being glad to have been born could nurture a more positive view about life and existence generally, and this could help someone to negotiate our cosmically meaningless and suffering-prone existence. It seems similar to the coping mechanisms that Peter Russell Zapf described in his essay The Last Messiah: isolation, attachment, distraction, and sublimation. I'm not going to go into these any further, but if you want to look into them more and understand them fully, then I've put a link in the description to the essay. Now, before we go on to look at a particularly extreme case of natalist Stockholm Syndrome, I want to go over one more thing. Someone could extend this observation of the relationship the glad to have been born have with their coming into existence to the relationship they also have with their parents, their creators. One could say that parents, through fulfilling their mere obligations to a child, like feeding, clothing, and housing, the child could and usually does develop positive feelings towards the parent, who ultimately were the ones who put them in harm's way in the first place and caused them to face death. This isn't the angle I chose to focus on because I don't think it's the healthiest approach. I think our relationships with our own coming into existence are a much more appropriate relationship to focus on. There is another relationship too, which I think could be worthy of the same sort of antinatalist analysis, and that's going to be the subject of the case study we're going to look at next. So one critique that Aldous Huxley had of George Orwell's depiction of authoritarianism was that it was defined by terror. Huxley submitted that a more sustainable form of authoritarianism wouldn't rest on horror, but more on manipulation, conditioning, and indoctrination, so that the populace would learn to love their oppression.
Take another book prophesying the future, which was a very remarkable book, George Orwell's 1984. There he foresaw a dictatorship using entirely the methods of terror, the methods of physical violence. Now, I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
So here a point is being made about dictators and authoritarians, but the same sort of point could be made about our genes. We exist essentially to serve our genes. We suffer as individuals to facilitate the furthering of our genes. For us to tolerate such harms through coming into existence, it seems to make sense evolutionarily for us to love our lives and rationalize the suffering, despite us being only used as tools for an unthinking replicating molecule. And I think that's much in the same way that Huxley is laying out. Rather than living under the dictatorship of a human, although many people do, we're all living under a dictatorship of our genes. Now, some people watching might think this is a bit of a grandiose framing, but I use it because Stockholm Syndrome can be really striking and strong in Natalists. The example I'm about to show is quite abhorrent in the amount of suffering that is being rationalized. This example I'm going to show shares with other things I've been speaking about, in that the individual is glad to have been born, but it differs in one way. The gratitude is being shown to God. Despite this, I think that the key points still carry over, and just as strong examples could be found in non-theistic settings as well.
Why did God give you cancer? Because God allowed it, right? Because God is in control.
Because he chose me.
And why did he choose you?
Because I'm a special boy.
You're a special boy. You are. But you've been through so much pain. Why did God say yes to that?
Because he chose me to do it.
And are you mad at God? At all? Why?
Because I'm glad that he chose me and not one of, like, Maddie or Emma.
Why?
Because then they're going to have to go through this.
And you don't want them to.
I'll let that example speak for itself. Now, before I close, I want to link this analysis to the case of future or assumed consent. Many natalists like to point out that most people are glad to have been born, as I think they try to use this as a justification for assuming consent in the person they want to create, or at least lessening the perceived harm that is going to be imposed on them. Now, I've already done a whole video on this, which I'll link in the description, and people can go check out if they want to, but I think Natalist Stockholm Syndrome is also relevant here. To show why, I've taken a quote from Heta Hyries, The Limits of Medical Paternalism, as I think it lays out the point quite well. But there is one difficulty with the doctrine of future consent, which is serious enough to refute it altogether. This is the possibility of manipulating the recipient of the paternalistic intervention in a manner that automatically leads to consent and gratitude later. Given a simple interpretation of the doctrine, it would be permissible for the public authorities to imprison people and turn them into religious or political fanatics, provided only that the manipulative program in question includes a section which teaches the brainwashed people themselves to appreciate the treatment when it is over. And it seems, at least to me, that similar critiques could be made of the retrospective consent that is given by people under the duress of Natalist Stockholm Syndrome. And that's not to say that anyone has intentionally manipulated our psychology, but that we've been conditioned by the environment and the people that we're surrounded by and interact with. Anyway, what did you think of this Stockholm Syndrome analysis? Let me know in the comments if you thought I pushed it too far, and I'll see you in the next one.